Hey guys, Ragnarok54 here, and welcome back to another RuneScape video. This time it is finally my Phase 4 melee minion tanking guide. Phase 4 is definitely the most variable phase, which also in my opinion makes it by far the hardest. This is what's really going to separate the pretty good people from the really good people at AOD, and if you're just kind of doing whatever on this phase, then you can still get really high gems if you do the rest of the kill perfectly. You can still hit like 5.9 mil. But if you want to get like 6 or 6.1, 6.2 and above, then you're also going to have to perfect this phase, and it's going to be pretty difficult, so let's get right into it. The first thing to do before even going to dummies is actually going to be to go to Anachronia. You may have already done this, but I know at least I have not done this, and I was wondering how people were traveling between pillars so quickly. You can actually attune your double surge anti-spam delay here at Anachronia. You just go to the lodestone, to the select turn, right-click attune movement, set up your surge to have an anti-spam delay of only 1. So once you've done this, and again you may have already done this and already be doing this, but it allows you to do something pretty cool, which is use a bladed dive and 2 surges during one global cooldown of an ability. So that means that you can be attacking one pillar and then do your last ability on it, travel to another pillar, and immediately after the global cooldown from that first ability is done, use another offensive ability. So a lot of times what I see people doing is losing 1 or even 2 global cooldowns traveling between pillars. They'll do an ability, and then bladed dive surge, and then surge again, and you'll notice that my second surge there triggered the global cooldown. But the whole purpose of this is to avoid that happening. So we're going to use some of the stuff that I showed in my Phase 2 guide, which is bladed diving on the same tick as an ability. So again, it's pretty simple. You just queue up your bladed dive ready to go here, do some abilities, and then on the same tick as you input that ability, just use your movement abilities, and then if you don't see any animation for the ability, then that's a sure sign that you've done it correctly. And then you'll really know if you're doing it correctly if your second surge does not trigger the global cooldown. So I'd really recommend practicing this at dummies. It's really hard to practice at AOD if you don't already do this, because there's just so much else going on during Phase 4. So just come up to the dummy, and then as you're attacking it, queue up your bladed dive here so it's ready to go right behind you here so that you can click and you'll bladed dive there. And then as you use your ability, so I'm going to use a dismember here so that you can see that it's actually applied the bleed to the dummy. As you use your dismember or whatever ability you're using, you're going to click to make the bladed dive go off, and then press your surge keybind all in quick succession. And then after you've done that, just keep spamming your click and your second surge so that it goes off before the global cooldown from that dismember finishes. So let's try to see if I can do it here. So I'm going to do those and then spam my surge, and then as you can see, I get back to the dummy as the dismember global cooldown finishes, and I can immediately use another offensive ability, losing no time at all. So I'd recommend practicing this at dummies until you can do it every time. It shouldn't take all that long. Once you've done like 10 minutes of practice, you should be pretty good at this, but I'd really recommend actually coming to dummies for this one, even if you didn't go to dummies for any of the other phases, just because it's going to be so much easier to practice here, and once you have the muscle memory, it's a lot easier to do at AOD. So there's going to be a lot more to this phase than just this, but movement is by far the most important part of this phase, so you want to make sure you have this down first. I'm not going to go over any rotations here because it's just so variable, and as long as you're doing this movement and following a couple like key principles in terms of ability rotations, then you'll be fine. And Phase 4 is all about learning how to improvise, since the orders are always going to be different. Sometimes people get Ruby SGBs, sometimes pillars take a long time, sometimes they're super fast. So it's all about improvisation and knowing what to do in different circumstances. So for most of this video, I'm just going to be showing examples of me doing Phase 4 and showing how I do some things correctly and how I mess up sometimes and how you should fix that and what you should do when things go wrong and what you should do when things go right, etc., etc. So let's just get into some examples then. Alright, so let's go over some of the general principles you're going to want to keep in mind when you're doing the pillars. On the rotation sheet, you'll notice that there is a rotation listed, and this is good, but you can't always do all of these abilities. You can't always have them off cooldown. You might not always have the adrenaline for them. And especially as you get on faster teams with ranged ents being more meta nowadays, the pillars are really going to disappear, so you're not going to have time to do all of this stuff. But there are still some good things to keep in mind from it. Generally, you're going to want to SGB on the first pillar, and then Hurricane on the first pillar if you can. If you can't, then you Hurricane on the second pillar, and then Assault on the second pillar if you have time / cooldowns. And then on the third pillar, if you have the Adrenaline, then you want to get in at least a 2-hit Flurry. If you really need the Zerk cooldown, then you're going to need to prioritize more hits of the Flurry. And then on the last pillar, you want to Zerk and then build with 188s on that last pillar. The rotation for pillars is really not nearly as set in stone as the rotations for the rest of the phases are. It's going to be super variable based on the pillar speed and your adrenaline and your cooldowns and everything, so don't be worried if you can't follow this rotation exactly, and I wouldn't even recommend trying to practice the rotation for these pillars. I just try to keep in mind the general principles of when to use each threshold, and to try to never use anything worse than a 188 or a Freedom Auto. Okay, so let's get into what can happen during some kills. I didn't talk about this too much at the end of my Phase 3 video, but it is important. You're going to want to leave at the correct time. You don't want to leave so early that you're just waiting by the first pillar for a while, but you also don't want to leave so late that you give your team shadows or you're just wasting abilities on an already phased Nex. This is something that you're just going to have to feel out with your team if you leave at 620k or if you leave at 675k. You're really going to have to feel it out with your team, see how much damage they do if people are still in their Zerks and Death Swiftness, or if they're already out. It's going to change when you actually need to leave. That said, it can still happen that you're spending some time doing nothing after you've gotten to the first pillar, and as you've probably noticed from the rest of the phases, you always want to try to capitalize on any time that you're not attacking something or doing damage. So for the first pillar, sometimes she's doing a special attack and she can't be phased, or maybe the whole team surged early and the base is having to do like 20k damage or something. You don't want to just sit there and do nothing and then attack the pillar normally. There's a couple of things you can do here on the first pillar. What I usually do, because inevitably people are going to surge a little bit early, I try to do a dual wield ability as my last ability on Nex and then equip my 2H as I'm surging away. That way, if there's any problems with the phasing, I can get in a 2H auto attack on the pillar before I use my first ability. If something goes really wrong and you have quite a bit of time, I'd recommend equipping your non-mobile switch and target cycle barging the pillar as soon as you see the yellow dot appear in the minimap. Then you can bleed either a flurry or a assault depending on your cooldowns and the speed of the team. This isn't going to happen super often, hopefully, but it's just important to keep in mind that every second that you're not like attacking something needs to be used to do more damage later, or it's just wasted time. A lot of times you're going to accidentally just press it too soon or too late, and you're not going to be leaving at the right time. Also, a lot of times the pillar is just going to die midway through your global cooldown. Maybe someone gets a huge SGB, or you were just like not on tick with the rest of the team or something. So this can happen pretty often, and if it does, you want to make sure to take advantage of it, because if you just Bladed Dive Surge a little bit late, and then your Surge triggers the next global cooldown, then you're going to arrive at the second pillar a whole global cooldown late, and you're going to be missing like 10 adrenaline that the rest of the team has. This is going to be really detrimental to your overall damage. So luckily there is a way to mitigate most of the loss from this, provided you can recognize it's happening pretty quickly. So if you notice that you do your last ability and then you accidentally wait a tick instead of Bladed Dive surging on the same tick, then instead of spamming your second surge so that it happens on the next global cooldown, instead you should spam something like Anticipate so that you get adrenaline from it, and then also surge on that same tick but after the anticipation. That way you'll still surge at the same time as if you were just spamming the surge, but instead you'll have extra adrenaline that you wouldn't have gotten from your mobile surge. You can also try to always make your last ability on a pillar dual wield, so that during this you can equip your 2H, and if it happens to go wrong and you need to spend that extra global cooldown using Anticipation and Surge, you can get a free 2H auto on the pillar. So just like that, we've turned a situation where you lost an entire global cooldown of damage and adrenaline into a situation where you got extra adrenaline from the basic and the auto attack, and you didn't lose that much damage since 2H autos are pretty strong. So in this example, we're finishing phase 3, and then I go to the first pillar, which is Glacies. We've got a bit of a bad order here, but as you can see, I do a 188 and then an SGB, and the pillar is going to die here pretty quickly. and for whatever reason, my first surge does not go off immediately. I notice this, and instead of surging second time, I anticipate and equip my 2H. I get a 4.4k 2H auto, and then I can immediately continue the rest of my rotation. Another way you can use the same technique is on the last pillar with your Zerk. So as you can see here, I'm killing the second to last pillar, and then I accidentally leave one tick too late, so my surge triggers the global cooldown, and I end up zerking an entire global cooldown late, and other things go wrong, and it's just a disaster. So what you can do instead is just do the same thing with the anticipation, except zerk instead of defensive. So here, I do the same thing, but this time I zerk with my 2H equipped, get the 2H auto and the zerk, and I've zerked on time and everything. If you're not good at doing the one global cooldown movement between pillars, this is a great thing to start implementing in your kills. Since it's so easy to do relatively, you just, after you bladed dive surge, make sure you're at 100% of course, and then spam zerk, and you should save an entire global cooldown, and it's not as difficult as getting the one global cooldown movement. Something that's become a lot more commonplace recently is using your power burst of acceleration between pillars. If you have multiple rangers on your team, then this is going to become even more necessary. Of course, you can fill it out with your team, but if you ever notice that you're close to or have your bladed dive on cooldown when you want to be using them between pillars, then this means that you need to be using your power burst. On fast teams, this means pretty much always using it on the first pillar before it's dead so that you can be sure to get to the second pillar on time. In this example, I use Fury and then Cleave, and I'm not sure if I'm going to have my bladed dive off cooldown, so I pop my power burst anyway, and then even though I bladed dive a little bit later than I should have, because I used the power burst, I was able to spam surge earlier than normal and get to the pillar without losing any ticks and immediately use that hurricane. An added benefit here is that using the power burst and then using bladed dive and surge does not put them on cooldown, so because the second pillar was also really fast, I would not have had my bladed dive surge off cooldown, but because I had used my power burst, they are off cooldown and I'm able to get to the third pillar on time. Sometimes this third pillar can be really fast too, and at a certain point there's just nothing more that you can do. You only have one dose of power burst to use. But I'd recommend looking to see if the first pillar is going to take a while, like if Nex didn't phase right away or something and you don't need to use your power burst, then you might as well save it for the second pillar and then pop it no matter what there so that you can go to the rest of the pillars with no problem. Bombs are another big part of P4. Admittedly, I'm really bad at dealing with bombs still, so I'm not sure how much help I can give you guys on this one, but I'll try to do my best. So not that long ago, it was the meta to just use your power burst of acceleration to like kind of one tick the bomb, go to the center, and then go right back to whatever amalgamation you were at. But as I just mentioned, you're going to be using your power burst of acceleration to travel between pillars now, so you can't really use that for bombs anymore. Luckily, one surge is generally enough to get you there, and you're going to lose a little bit of time, but it's a lot better than saving your power burst for a potential bomb. Generally, what you're going to want to do is when you get a bomb, bladed dive surge to the next pillar and then barge instead of doing the second surge, and then as your bomb is about to pop, just surge to the center. You may have time to do an ability or two on the pillar that you barge to, depending on when you actually get the bomb, and this is just going to take some feeling out like most other things on P4, but once you do it a couple times, you'll be able to improvise it and just get the timing down so that you surge right as the bomb's about to go off. The hardest bombs are the ones that you get as you're traveling to the last pillar. If your team is full of meleeers and your last 600k is going to be pretty fast, then I recommend zerking as soon as you get to the pillar after you barge if you have time, and then trying to build some adrenaline as you deal with the bomb, like not using mobile for your surge to the middle, or using like a resonance or something if you're not going to be able to attack the boss. This can also potentially lead to you getting a greater barge buff, so just make sure to keep that in mind because that can be useful if you do have to end up not attacking next for 2 global cooldowns. If you have a lot of rangers, then your last 600k is probably going to be decently slow, so you might be able to wait to zerk until after you've gone to the center. After you've gone to the center, I'd recommend getting back on next as soon as you can without using any movement abilities, and then positioning yourself so that you can surge away or through next or whatever as your bomb is about to actually be dropped. Try to use this surge off a global cooldown, and then if possible you can just use an ability and walk back to next, and if you are out of range of that a little bit, then you can just use that ability and then bladed dive back in. You might remember that bladed diving does not get rid of a stalled ability, so you'll be able to just click on next to release that ability. You may occasionally have to use your bladed dive to get away from next to actually drop the bomb down, and that's okay, but you're just going to lose a little bit of damage because you're not going to be able to stall an ability, and sometimes it's harder to use the surges off global cooldown precisely. The last 600k is fairly straightforward. You can just more or less follow the rotation that's listed. Of course, you can swap around the 188s and stuff. The important stuff is just that you want to get a assault in your Zerk as well as a hurricane. You can get the 5-tick auto attack hurricane off. It's not that hard to do, and it gives you a nice boost of damage. You can also do it with a flank depending on your cooldowns, but it's not that important if you don't get it in either, because you might also be able to sneak in a Dragon Claw spec or something like that depending on your adrenaline. If you're on a little bit of a slower team and you're able to A-pot for the last 600k, then you can definitely get in a D-Claws in your Zerk and maybe another one afterward. This might require going to the hub between kills to get adrenaline, so just, your mileage may vary on the last 600k. The important things to know are just do the assault and then 5-tick hurricane if you can, and Dragon Claws if you can. Alright, this video is getting long enough at this point. I feel like I could probably just drone on for hours about different Phase 4 stuff on the pillars and even the last 600k, but a lot of it's just going to be so variable that it's not too worth getting into. If you're interested in having just kind of a P4 review video where I just go over a ton of just examples, good and bad, no discrimination, and just talking about all the different stuff, then let me know in the comments. I could do something like that if you guys want more information on Phase 4. But at the end of the day, the damage you're going to be getting from Phase 4 is fairly simple to pull off rotation-wise, and the difficult part's going to be the movement and dealing with bombs. Alright, so I hope you guys enjoyed my series of guides on melee minion tanking at AOD. I hope that they have helped you improve a little bit. If they did, please leave a like. These guides have taken me a really long time to make, and it takes a long time just to comb through all the hours and hours of footage that I have to find some good examples. I am planning to make maybe a couple more videos going into some specific things that I didn't get a chance to cover in each individual phase video, so be on the lookout for those in the future. But until next time, I will see you guys later. Bye.